From a 906 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello,
Hello?
this is Nick from Michigan.
Nick from Michigan. What's on your mind?
Um, First off, I just wanted to, I wanted to call in and thank you guys for, helping to expand my knowledge of left-wing and socialist politics. I happen to be a socialist myself, and I actually ran for local office this year during the election. I lost, but I got 23% of the vote in my village, so that's actually a pretty big win considering it's a very red district.
Good for
I'm
you.
in Jack Bergman's district.
Oh,
So,
my. Oosh. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, the other day I was listening to Michael's show, and he had on Professor Richard Wolff, who was talking about Althusser and the impact of ideology on our capitalist system, and that got me thinking. So I was wondering, do you guys see the right wing's focus on their defense of cultural norms such as gender, race, religion, or their demands for political civility as a natural reaction on the part of our capitalist system to maintain conditions for the replication of its social institutions, because the left represents a change in or a reinterpretation of American social ideology, and therefore a change in the conditions under which these institutions exist? And is this another contradiction within capitalism, in that in order to maintain these social institutions, it must maintain public trust and control over the ideology, yet it undermines that trust in its pursuit of profit and exposes its own ideological hypocrisy? For example, private prison corporations profiting from the media's fear-mongering by using it as an excuse to build what are essentially concentration camps, while at the same time, that sort of thing contradicts the American social ideology of being a nation of immigrants and causes cognitive dissonance within our population.
Well, the quick answer is yeah, I think so for the most part. Look, I don't know. I mean, maybe at one level it is. There are, yeah. I mean, maybe at the top level, when you get to talk about the think tanks, they fundamentally understand that the emancipation of people across our society and making our society more egalitarian in terms of putting aside economics, but just in terms of like cultural values and the merit associated with skill sets and predispositions of different people and life experiences of different people, fundamentally undermines the existing power structure. It's not clear to me that you couldn't still maintain capitalism, with those older institutions falling, but there's certainly more of a threat to it, right?
Right.
Because you're bringing in a different set of values, and one would be correct in being worried about it. And I mean, look,
right.
I don't know if it's a coincidence that Medicare, gets passed around the same time in our history as the Civil Rights Act. I mean, I've never, read anybody who's like theorized that, but one, it's not hard to imagine that as more people get invited into, the power structure, as the power structure becomes
Right.
more diverse, that other ideas and expectations of what government should do, change.
Although those weren't, I think the balance is like, I think it's like, how specifically do you define it as like counterculture or not counterculture? Like I'm of of the school that you take these movements for essentially civil rights across the board, and you like assert them inside and are like counter hegemonic to them, versus trying to say you're like trying to completely uproot and disregard them. So like, you know, if you look at things like civil rights and even like Michael Harrington writing about the other America at that time, that came out in the early 60s, right? Wasn't that part of the impetus behind like the war on poverty and things like that? The rhetoric and the politics of it was, we need this country and its discourses and its hegemonic ideas about democracy and about opportunity, which we all know are hypocritical and didn't live in any way up to its verbiage, but we actually need it to. We're going to like force it to. And so those movements were not like, they were positing like an enlargement and a redefinition, not like a sort of disregarding of those things. And I think that that's
like
where
the all men are created equal thing.
Yeah. Okay. So really, let's do that. And I think that's where, you know,
Right.
and that's where like the Gramscian ideas to me are a little bit more interesting than Althusser.
But if you make all men created equal, and regardless of what the rhetoric has been, if you actually do that, all people are created equal, it's, I hate to say it, zero sum. And someone is going to be losing power. And even if they're just losing it in a cultural sense, put aside for a moment economics, even if they're just losing it in a cultural sense, once you lose it in a cultural sense.
Yeah, that doesn't really.
Well, this speaks to the limits of liberal values, right? Because a statement like all people are created equal could be used to support something very conservative and meritocratic, and say, well, you know, some people have more than others because everyone's created equal, and some people work harder than other people do, right?
Originally was.
I guess
popular democracy affects how we interpret these things.
Right. And I guess also, I guess if I understand your question correctly, which I don't know if I am, which I'm trying to speak to, I think those are good points. Just trying to, I think the point I'd have for you is I think that there are some things that are, and by the way, I think there are things that capitalism facilitates that are desirable in certain instances, right? Like for sure. But I don't think that some movements of Patreon.com/TMBS, desirable aspect of capitalism. I think though that like there are definitely some like social means of social progress that come along with capitalism that are good things, but they don't pose any type of fundamental threat to capitalism in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And I think that, so I think that's like, no, like marriage equality, do I support it? Is it absolutely essential? Absolutely, no question. Is that something that's going to threaten the market system? Not at all.
Well, here's the thing. When you sever class politics from what we now know as quote unquote identity politics, you can have a progressive identity politics without having a progressive class politics. Now, everyone in this room knows that you cannot actually help the majority of women, minorities, etc., without redistributive programs economically. But I mean, I think, is the question about the difference between the right and left wing approaches to these issues? Because
the question was, as far as I know, was, are conservatives right to be afraid of social change as a threat to capitalism? And I think, you know, like, let me put it this way.
Depends what kind.
Yeah,
well, yes,
kind of
but I also think,
you are and where you are
but
in
I
the
think
class hierarchy.
it's certainly
Goldman
understandable.
Sachs doesn't care if you're gay. Like,
no, well,
not at all.
Well, and it certainly it seems to be more of a defense of social institutions, which are themselves a part of our capitalist system. Say, for example, the war on Christmas sort of thing, or the war on religion in a I guess in a broader sense, if you want to include the struggles of, you know, homosexual people and LGBTQ and all that.
I don't think in today's phase of capitalism that's true.
There are pros and cons to it for the ruling class, honestly.
Silicon Valley, Wall Street enabled capitalism doesn't care about that stuff. No, well, and can profit handsomely
they have
off of
no
it.
use for overt racism anymore and overt sexism, as long as they can still benefit from the fact that we have a permanently racialized underclass. Women get paid less than men. Those things are still enshrined. So why would they care about?
I'm not convinced that marriage equality doesn't in some way erode some of the underpinnings of capitalism.
How?
Insofar as it's going to have an impact, it's going to weaken the power of other institutions that I think maintain capitalism in our society.
If anything, it opens up way more opportunities for capitalism and markets. I mean,
well, that may be the case in terms of short term, but I think in terms of the idea of religion becoming weakened, I think is.
You think religion props
Capitalism
in America
destroys
in today's
religion.
world? Yeah, capitalism is totally junking religion across the globe today.
Capitalism is
In late stage
essentially
capitalism,
co-opted parts of
Yeah.
religion.
but in late stage capitalism right now, as it's constituted,
It's done a very good
religion's
job.
I
not
mean,
a
the religious
major
people
part
I
of it.
know are capitalists, though.
But
I mean-
not it's not a driver of global capitalism.
It
In
dissolves
today's
all
world,
social bonds,
in
including
today's
I think it- I
those
think
it's-
of
stretch.
I think
old-timey
that-
religions.
well,
Yeah, I don't know about all
I,
that.
I mean, I think I think Donald Trump got into office in the context of this country because of religious affiliations, right? I mean, that is the case. I mean, and I mean, I think that it's. I don't think that that capitalism helps religion necessarily at all, but
I mean, for what it's
I think
worth.
religion is definitely, when you have a structure and a system that has a specific hierarchy and can be called upon to support, it's called upon to support, it seems to me, far more effectively capitalism
What would you
than a
consider
rival
to be
to
the
it.
most powerful religious institution in the world? Like, if you just had to pick one as an institution, not a religion, what's the most powerful religious
Well, probably
institution?
the Catholic Church.
Right. Listen to what the Pope says about capitalism and market policies and how that is nothing to do with anything that happens even in Catholic majority countries. It's totally disregarded.
I mean,
Yeah, but I don't. That's not what I'm not. That doesn't. I mean, and I don't know that.
Well, I
that
mean,
disproves
people
my point at
disregard
all.
the story of
Yeah.
Jesus and the money changers
Yeah,
too.
exactly. That doesn't mean anything. It's a question of
Well, no,
how
it-
does
it
capitalism
means a
use
lot.
what does capitalism use to promulgate
Well,
itself?
but I
And-
mean, by that same token, I mean, liberation theology, religion can be used for anything.
Well,
I'm
no, I
saying
understand
that-
religion
I'm
It's a
saying-
second order
Well,
thing.
that's
it's
yeah, it's
far
a
more
second- it's a
successfully
second
used.
order thing,
It's far
and
more successfully used by capitalists.
Not necessarily.
I mean,
Depends where
we
you
would
look,
not have
but
fascism in
today's-
this country if it weren't for white Catholics.
That's true. But in today's world, the Catholic Church, even conservative religious institutions, are opposed to, and sometimes we would be aligned with capitalists. I'm aligned with capitalists who want Saudi Arabia to move out of gender apartheid.
Well, Catholicism
but-
isn't the most powerful institution of religion in this country. I think in this
Well,
country,
I'm talking globally. I'm just saying there are plenty in today's moment. There's a huge amount of conflict where religious sensibility could run up against market logic, and market logic's always going to win. And
mean,
I
when
Yeah,
we're
but
trying to
that's not what I'm
decide
talking
about social
that's what I'm
progress,
talking
right,
about.
and whether or not the social, insofar as it can be divorced from the economic, is a kind of progress that's going to undermine the capitalist system. I think it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog. Like, I'm not a 100% materialist reductionist like some Marxists out there. I think it's more of a dialectic than that. There is some give and take between the two, but generally speaking, stuff like religion and the social sphere is the second order thing that follows based upon who's got the material power in the world, you know?
right.
yeah, but that's not necessarily, I think,
Or like-
dispositive of the idea that that the more egalitarian our institutions become, the more it weakens capitalism. Those are not. I mean, that's the point.
I mean, libertarians sure thought the expansion of voting rights was going to spell troubles for capitalism. Like this is
Well, but that
just
literally
demonstrably
does. That is.
Isn't that what we're talking about?
But it does, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
of
but it
course it
does.
does.
I mean, that's
yeah,
why.
capitalism and democracy. There's
it does.
contradiction
Well, I
between
know
those.
essentially
that's
what
why-
drives,
that's why I made a
the
distinction in the
capitalist
beginning
system
between-
to capture the political sphere.
Well, I think there's a difference.
is
though,
because
between
of the
changing
threat of
social-
democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think he's trying to to reckon with why certain formations of capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, like I don't know, Obama centrism, can deal with equality for gay people, trans people, women, etc. You know, nominal equality within the system, and why more right wing formations can't. Right?
But can Obama's brand
Exactly.
can Obama's brand fully deal with it, or can it just appear to deal with those and address those issues?
Oh.
Like I don't think like Obama's capitalism could persist under a world where you leveled wealth.
Well, I was trying to make a distinction between, I guess what I'm saying is I think, because I would put things like voting rights in the democracy category, which to me automatically implicates the things you're talking about, Matt. But I would say, like, as an example, like, I don't know that, but people getting the right to vote in the South and voting for a completely different economic agenda has a much more one-to-one relationship than people getting marriage equality.
Right.
Those are very.
Or what
different
about,
things.
But those
Very,
are,
very
no,
different
no.
things.
I don't think. I think they're indicative of the. I'm not saying they're indicative of emancipatory movements.
It's getting a place within the existing system,
exactly.
a seat
But
at the table. You
but
know,
the implications
And-
of certain social, like what we
Well,
watch
yeah, there's variance.
and accept on television could be, as an example, a great form of social and cultural progress does not have the same at all implications for how we design an economy as people in the South getting voting
Listen,
rights.
it may be the case.
I mean, that's a
that
stretch to equate those
I
things.
think that when we look back on if we're in a position in 30 years or 40 years of a far more socialistic society in America, okay? Because I don't know I can't track the emancipatory politics in other countries, but in America, we will see marriage equality as part of a decline of existing institutions that were the pillars of capitalism in this country. And
as
I
it
think
existed historically.
yes,
not modern.
and I think voting rights are certainly that's
Well,
how we started off by saying
yeah.
that Medicare, or I said
here's another-
Medicare and the Civil Rights Act
But-
took place around the same time, because as you bring more people into the system and give them more power and more rights, which is what marriage equality is, right? It's a
well,
whole
there
set
were
of
radical queer activists who were opposed to anyone doing activism around marriage equality, because that was just going to bring this historically marginalized class of people, like some certain representatives, like the most well-to-do among them,
Well, I understand,
into a system that
but
supports
in
and upholds.
2004, it was a massive tool for the Bush to get reelected. And that tool is gone, and it was replaced in some respects by not something terribly different, an open seat on the Supreme Court, and that brought Trump in. I mean, so
Yeah, well, the left and right wings of neoliberalism weaponize identity in different ways.
I agree, but I'm saying that I'm addressing the question of does social change and emancipatory politics, putting aside for a moment economics, threaten capitalism? Are conservatives right to feel it? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think
Not always.
Don't you think? I mean, just the last.
You know
couple
what?
Not
It's-
always.
It's
No, no,
complicated.
just
right,
the last
but you shouldn't
couple-
always be worried you're going to get hit by a bus if you run across the street. But in general, yes, it's a fear you should have.
And I think one really important thing that needs to happen is these struggles need to be connected back to one another. Class politics,
Exactly, and they need to be
identity
connected
politics.
to the root cause of the inequalities in our system.
I would
Appreciate
run
the call,
across
Nick.
The street. Don't worry about buses.
It's an interesting
I'd like to see you do that
question.
in Flatbush.
Like I think there's
Don't actually. You should worry about buses.
I think there's something too
For real.
when reactionaries throughout time have been called people agitating for women's liberation or black civil rights, to call them communists. I don't think they're completely mistaken about that. I think they actually do sense something very deep about
But
Oh
capitalism.
yeah,
you
and
know-
the
but
attack
you
on the
know the
welfare state was
difference.
completely racialized.
But you know the difference between and this is something Adolf Reed writes about. And this is where it's like we can't equate all of these things. Like in the last couple of decades, there being some very necessary and positive and hugely important cultural advances in terms of what's some of them. I could even marriage equality, set that aside maybe, but at the same time that there has been some major broadening of cultural agreements around rights for certain groups of people, and even just what is civically acceptable, which has of course been blown up by Trump, there's still a massive increase in inequality, including some very racialized inequality. So even by the time you get to Reagan, you look at the literature, schools are getting right back into resegregation levels of pre-civil rights. And on a policy level, it's actually moving in all the wrong directions, even as on a cultural level, there's a broader, you know what, we do need to have more black sitcom actors. We do need to, and which by the way, those things are super important. I'm not saying
and
at
help
the
for
expense,
social reproduction. Right?
Absolutely. It's not an either or, but it's very important to not falsely equate that just because those trends are moving in the right direction, that they're working on the core economic levels. That's the point.
Yeah, the way I view it is you get those things out of the way because they need to be dealt with, and then it frees you up to focus on more things that we're focusing on.
Smart
I
and
don't think
sincere
it's
strategy,
the-
but I think
it's a little bit of a bank shot, but to go through. I mean, I agree with what Matt is saying in terms of you do those things because they're the right thing to do. They would not be the first
we all agree
arrow
with that.
you pull out of a quiver to undermine capitalism in some way. Although I think it's probably somewhat essential. I mean, you're not going to get. I mean, well, maybe that's not true.
You basically
the
deal
most
with
socialistic thing that we had.
I think this is where I do agree with Jamie, though. There is absolutely a politics that says you do not have to deal with those core issues as long as certain areas of cultural replication and reproduction are represented and produced. As an example, a friend of mine who works in AIDS and activism related to LGBT teens, he said after we accomplished marriage equality, there was a massive drop-off in terms of donor support and interest in those issues, specifically of homelessness in that community.
Right.
That's what I'm pointing to.
I mean, two things. The enemy of our enemy is not necessarily our friend, right? Just because Republicans oppose marriage equality doesn't mean that marriage equality is going to be an economically progressive force in the world. And two, there's not a one-to-one comparison with most of these things. They are connected, but it's not a straight line. We can't just assume that social progress is going to continue because that's the way it happens. I mean, we saw Weimar Germany was extremely socially progressive. People were able to be queer in public. And then, you saw what happened with the rise of Hitler, not that long later. And it's not exclusive to capitalist formations either. Unfortunately, the early Soviet Union was also very socially progressive. Alexander Kollontai was in charge of basically the entire social sphere. Women and gay people had rights in the early 1900s that they don't even have in some places now. And then Stalin rolled it way the hell back with his regressive version of communism. So I guess what I'm trying to say is they are connected, but it's not a given,
Right.